In May 2010, a special vessel approached Pinta Island, a place that had deteriorated into something resembling a dead landscape, with many areas reduced to little more than low scrub. Yet into that devastation, the ship brought 39 extremely rare giant tortoises. But they could not simply open the cages and release them on the beach. Individuals weighing nearly 220 pounds had to be secured, suspended beneath wooden poles, and carried almost 2.5 miles into the island's interior. 4 rangers took turns bearing the load on their shoulders, struggling forward step by step across sharp volcanic rocks. Under the intense heat, with their shoulders aching, they had to repeat the same exhausting task for 3 days and nights. As soon as they were released, the tortoises immediately began grazing, pushing into the brush, using their massive bodies to break branches and open up new pathways. Rangers also observed Darwin's finches, mockingbirds, and lava lizards appearing around the patches of ground the tortoises had just disturbed while feeding. But this was not a breeding project or an effort to preserve an extremely rare species. Every one of these tortoises had already been sterilized. They had been brought here to carry out a much greater mission. How could these tortoises solve 2 of the biggest ecological problems on an island designated as a World Heritage Site? Pinta is one of Ecuador's most unusual islands, located far from the mainland and completely uninhabited. There are no native deer, goats, horses, or other large mammals commonly found on the continent. In this isolated ecosystem, the Pinta giant tortoise was the island's dominant large animal, once numbering as many as 10,000 individuals, and it was also one of the most important species in the entire ecosystem. Just look at this example to see how important the tortoises were. They ate Opuntia fruit and dispersed the seeds in nutrient-rich droppings, helping the cacti continue to grow. As they moved across the island, the tortoises also created open patches of ground that served like runways for seabirds to take off. One species of tortoise connected the plants, the birds, and the landscape itself. But that was when the island was still alive. Do you remember the devastated landscape from the beginning? What turned this paradise into a dead land? But even before Pinta collapsed because of invasive species, humans had already taken away the island's most important ecosystem engineer. Beginning in the 19th century, whaling ships repeatedly stopped at the Galápagos, capturing the slow-moving giant tortoises and loading them aboard as a source of food. Records from the United States show that between 1,831 and 1,868, at least 455 Pinta tortoises were taken from the island. And in the years that followed, the number continued to rise. Finally, by 1906, an expedition could find only 12 females and 2 males. Think about that number for a moment. One extremely rare species on Earth had been reduced to just 14 individuals. But things gradually became even worse in 1959, when fishermen released just 3 goats onto the island as a source of food. Pinta had no predators or people to keep them under control. 10 years later, their population had increased 1,000-fold, eventually exploding to around 40,000. The problem was that the island was simply too small to support so many invasive goats. Day and night, they grazed on grass, young plants, and shrubs, giving the vegetation little chance to recover. As the green cover gradually disappeared, the volcanic soil was left exposed, erosion intensified, and the last remaining areas of suitable habitat for the Pinta tortoise shrank dramatically. When goats became the island's biggest ecological problem, humans spent the next 30 years trying to eradicate them. So what did tortoises have to do with that process? Almost nothing. They could only return after that battle was over. And that would become the decisive turning point in Pinta's recovery. Beginning in 1971, rangers traveled across Pinta and removed more than 41,000 goats. Vegetation quickly began to recover, and the island was declared goat-free twice, once in 1985 and again around 1990. But both declarations were wrong. The problem was the last few survivors. Once their numbers dropped to only a handful, they became extremely difficult to find across the island's vast volcanic terrain. By the time people discovered them, they had often already reproduced, allowing the population to grow again. That cycle continued for years. Then, in 1999, conservationists changed their strategy. They released 28 radio-collared Judas goats, taking advantage of the animal's natural herd instinct so they would seek out the remaining wild goats themselves. Radio signals, GPS, hunting dogs, and systematic searches eventually helped track down the final survivors. By around 2003, the invasive goats had finally disappeared, and Pinta began turning green again. But then another problem emerged. In many areas, shrubs and woody vegetation recovered, but they grew so quickly that they began blocking sunlight from lower-growing species such as Darwin's aster and Galapagos cotton. After spending 30 years trying to remove one grazing animal, scientists realized that Pinta still needed another grazer, but this time, it needed tortoises. The problem was that there were almost no Pinta tortoises left to bring back. Although they later discovered one additional individual, Lonesome George, adding genetic diversity beyond the original 14 tortoises, years of attempts to breed him failed to produce a new generation. So Felipe Cruz, along with Linda Kao, Washington Tapia, James Gibbs, and their colleagues, began considering a smarter solution, using hybrid tortoises to temporarily replace the ecological role of the lost Pinta tortoise. The origin of these tortoises was unusual as well. After Galapagos National Park was established, many tortoises that had previously been kept by local residents were turned over to the park. In the early years, tortoises from different populations were sometimes kept together, producing a group of hybrids. They were not suitable for purebred conservation programs, but they had the size, grazing behavior, and seed dispersal abilities that Pinta was missing. That immediately raised a basic question. If they could do the ecological work of the Pinta tortoise, why should they spend their entire lives behind fences? But that immediately created another problem. If these hybrid tortoises reproduced on Pinta, a few decades later the island could be filled with descendants carrying mixed genetic ancestry, making any future effort to restore the Pinta tortoise far more complicated. So in November 2009, all 25 males and 14 females selected for the project were sterilized. They would be allowed to live, feed, move around, and shape the vegetation, but they would not be allowed to establish a new population. The precautions did not stop there. Before the journey, the tortoises underwent health checks, were treated for parasites, and had their diets carefully controlled for several weeks to reduce the risk of carrying seeds from non-native plants onto Pinta. The scientists understood the lesson of the goats all too well. Introducing just one species into the wrong place could force an entire island to pay the price for decades. This time, they could not afford to repeat that mistake. Finally, after months of preparation, all 39 tortoises were ready. In May 2010, they were loaded onto a ship bound for Pinta. Some were fitted with GPS units, while others carried VHF and satellite transmitters so that their movements could be tracked after release. Elizabeth Hunter and a small team would even remain on the island for several weeks to see where the tortoises went, what they ate, and whether they could survive. After only about a year, the first signs were already very clear. The tortoises that were weighed again had all gained weight, averaging about 10.9 kilograms each, more than 22% of their body mass. They also did not remain near the release sites, but gradually spread from the lowlands into higher areas of Pinta, finding food on their own and establishing their own home ranges. This showed that the hybrid tortoises, despite having previously lived under human care, had adapted well to life in the wild. More importantly, after decades without one, Pinta finally had a large grazing animal again. Now let's return to the biggest question in the story. How did the tortoises begin to rebuild the ecosystem? Goats had once been present at enormous densities, eating plants faster than the island could regenerate them. Tortoises, by contrast, move slowly, feed selectively, and affect the vegetation in small patches at a time. They lower their heads to eat grass, low-growing plants, fruit, and cactus, helping keep some areas from becoming completely overrun by shrubs. Whenever a tortoise weighing dozens of kilograms moves into dense brush, its massive body presses branches downward, snaps smaller twigs, and leaves an opening behind it. If multiple tortoises keep using the same route, that pathway gradually stays open. These small trails allow sunlight to reach the ground, creating space for grasses and low-growing plants to grow, instead of being completely shaded out by woody vegetation. For an island facing increasingly dense vegetation after the goats disappeared, this was exactly the kind of disturbance Pinta had been missing for decades. But the more important work happened after the tortoises ate. The saddleback tortoises were especially fond of Opuntia cactus. In some observations, they spent as much as 57.6% of their foraging time feeding on this cactus. The tortoises swallowed the fruit, including the seeds, and then continued moving hundreds of meters across the island. Those seeds passed through their digestive systems and were eventually deposited in a completely different location, right inside the tortoise's nutrient-rich droppings. The data showed a fairly clear change. In 2010, only about 6.6% of the dung samples examined contained cactus seeds. By 2011, that figure in the saddleback group had risen to about 36.8%. In other words, the tortoises were not just eating Opuntia, they were carrying the next generation of cactus across Pinta. And the impact did not stop with plants. In the very first days after release, rangers observed Darwin's finches, mockingbirds, and lava lizards appearing around patches of ground that had just been trampled and disturbed by the tortoises. When tortoises displaced leaves, small branches, and the top layer of soil, insects and other tiny food sources underneath became easier to reach. Other species immediately took advantage of that opportunity. Of course, that does not mean just 39 tortoises caused the island's entire bird or lizard populations to increase, but it does show something even more important. Every step a tortoise takes can create a chain of effects behind it. There is also one important fact that needs to be made clear. 39 tortoises could not restore all of Pinta on their own simply by waiting a few more decades. The island covers nearly 6,000 hectares, while the number of tortoises released was far too small to create a strong effect across the entire landscape. A scientific model simulating 50 years showed that when tortoise density reached at least about 0.7 individuals per hectare, woody vegetation declined significantly in roughly 81% of the scenarios. For the portion of habitat studied on Pinta, that could mean around 2,000 tortoises, not 39. But if that was the case, why didn't scientists simply bring thousands more to the island? Because the original 39 tortoises were only an experiment, they were all hybrids and they had been sterilized. If thousands of tortoises with the wrong genetic background were released onto Pinta and allowed to reproduce freely, humans could create an entirely new problem a few decades later. A massive hybrid population permanently living on the very island that once belonged to the Pinta tortoise. So before increasing the numbers, scientists first had to answer a much more difficult question. Which tortoises should actually become the long-term residents of Pinta? In August 2022, 12 years after the first release, a team of 16 scientists and rangers returned to the island for the first major ecological survey on a comparable scale since 2011. They traveled through areas once devastated by goats, examining Opuntia cactus, woody vegetation, trails frequently used by tortoises, and signs of seed dispersal. The results showed that Pinta had changed significantly. Vegetation had recovered strongly after the goats disappeared, while the tortoises were creating positive effects by opening up clearings, maintaining pathways, and carrying the seeds of native plants to new locations. But even after 12 years, the project still could not be considered complete. Those 39 tortoises had not produced a new generation because from the beginning they had been designed as a bridge population. Their role was to keep part of the island's ecological functions operating, while scientists searched for a long-term solution, a tortoise population that could reproduce, sustain itself, and become large enough to continue this work across generations without human intervention. The problem seemed almost impossible to solve after the 24th of June 2012, when Lonesome George died. The last known purebred Pinta tortoise was gone, and the Pinta tortoise was declared extinct. But in another sense, the Pinta tortoise may not have disappeared completely. Hundreds of kilometers from Pinta, on the slopes of Wolf Volcano on Isabella Island, scientists discovered several hybrid tortoises that still carry genetic traces of the Pinta lineage. The explanation lies in a story that began centuries ago. Sailors and whaling ships once collected tortoises from multiple islands for food, then abandoned some of the survivors on Isabella. Some Pinta tortoises may have survived there, bred with local tortoises, and passed their genes down through generations. In 2020, a large-scale expedition involving about 45 scientists and rangers, divided into 12 teams, surveyed nearly 77 square miles of Wolf Volcano. They brought 31 tortoises back to the Conservation Center for study, including one young female identified as having Pinta tortoise ancestry. Later surveys continued searching for individuals carrying genetic traces of the lost lineage. Lonesome George is gone, and the purebred Pinta tortoise is extinct, but part of its genetic legacy may still be living on in hybrid tortoises on another island. That means Pinta's future has not yet been decided. Does the island need 1,000 tortoises? Or 2,000? Or even more? And more importantly, should they be tortoises carrying Pinta genes, a saddleback lineage with a similar ecological role, or a population selected from several different sources? But Pinta's greatest value lies not only in the fact that the island was rescued from invasive goats. What people learned here after decades of failure, experimentation, and constant adjustments in strategy became the foundation for much larger restoration programs across the Galapagos. It was on Pinta that rangers refined the use of Judas goats, radio telemetry, GPS, systematic searches, and especially methods for tracking down the very last surviving individuals, the hardest stage of any invasive species eradication campaign. That experience was later applied to Project Isabella, a restoration effort on a scale far larger than anything attempted on Pinta. In northern Isabella, there were once an estimated 100,000 feral goats destroying vegetation and competing with native species. This time, people could not simply hunt them one by one on foot. Helicopters were brought in to track and remove goat herds across the island's vast volcanic terrain. In just the first 7 months of aerial hunting, more than 55,000 goats were eliminated. But just like on Pinta, the hardest problem emerged when the goat population was nearly gone. Once only a few individuals remained scattered across an enormous landscape, hunting teams could hardly find them on their own. So around 770 Judas goats were released, fitted with tracking devices, and used their natural instinct to seek out other goats, leading people directly to the remaining herds. Think about that transformation. A small island covering less than 60 square kilometers, which had struggled for decades to eliminate its last few goats, ultimately became the place where the Galapagos learned how to tackle invasive species problems many times larger. If you want to know what Pinta's future might look like, look to Floreana Island. It once experienced an almost identical tragedy. The Floreana giant tortoise was exploited by sailors and whaling ships until it disappeared in the mid-19th century. When Charles Darwin arrived there in 1835, he witnessed a population already heading toward collapse. For more than 180 years afterward, not a single Floreana tortoise walked on its native island. But the story took an unexpected turn in 2000. On Wolf Volcano on Isabella Island, scientists discovered tortoises with unusually shaped saddleback shells. DNA analysis later revealed that some of them were hybrid descendants carrying ancestry from the supposedly extinct Floreana tortoise. The most likely explanation is that centuries ago, sailors removed tortoises from Floreana and later abandoned some surviving individuals on Isabella, where they bred with the local population and quietly preserved Floreana genes across generations. Beginning in 2015, 19 tortoises with Floreana ancestry were brought from Wolf Volcano to the breeding center on Santa Cruz. Together with individuals already there, an official breeding program was launched in 2017. Through careful genetic selection, scientists produced young tortoises with a very high proportion of Floreana ancestry. They were raised for 12 to 14 years until they were large enough to have a better chance of surviving in the wild. And on the 20th of February 2026, something that once seemed impossible finally happened. A total of 158 young tortoises carrying the Floreana lineage were released back onto the island after more than 180 years of absence. The release was carefully timed with the rainy season, when vegetation and food were most abundant. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, tortoise tracks once again appeared on the soil of Floreana. But those 158 tortoises were only the beginning. Floreana had been devastated by invasive rats, feral cats, and many other introduced species. Today, more than 50 species are still classified as threatened, and at least 13 endemic species have disappeared locally. The restoration project aims to remove invasive mammals, restore habitat, and reintroduce 12 native species that have vanished from the island. Giant tortoises are the first species in that plan. That is why Floreana carries a special message for Pinta. A tortoise lineage can disappear from its native island for more than a century, but if part of its genetic legacy survives somewhere else, the door to recovery may not be completely closed. What Floreana achieved in 2026 is exactly the kind of future conservationists still hope might one day become possible on Pinta. Today, Pinta looks very different from the island that was once devastated by tens of thousands of goats. Vegetation has returned. Tortoise trails have reappeared through the brush, Seeds are once again being carried across the landscape, and some of the ecological functions that had disappeared are gradually coming back to life. But this story is still not over. The 39 tortoises were only the first experiment. The real goal is to build a population that can reproduce, sustain itself, and become large enough to keep shaping Pinta for generations without human intervention. And perhaps the most hopeful part is that while the purebred Pinta tortoise may be extinct, traces of its genetic legacy still survive in hybrid tortoises found elsewhere in the Galapagos. Maybe one day, tortoises carrying a greater proportion of Pinta genes will once again walk across the very island their ancestors once dominated. Do you think humans should use closely related species to replace the ecological role of a species that has gone extinct? Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories like this about nature's recovery. And don't miss the next video, because there are still places on Earth where the return of just one animal species has been enough to begin transforming an entire ecosystem.